Hello everyone and welcome. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Lyndall Manson and I'm the Director of Governance, Policy and Projects at TAFE Directors Australia. Thank you for joining us for today's TAFE Talk session, which is on ASQA's approach to regulation with TAFE at the heart. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we're all meeting on the lands of the traditional custodians right across Australia. I'm coming to you from the beautiful blue sky and sunshiny Naarm, which is Melbourne, on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. And I pay my respects to their elders past and present and to any First Nations peoples joining us today. If you would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that you are currently on, please feel free to do so in the chat. We would love to hear from you. So to briefly set the scene for our discussion today with ASQA, as you are all aware, there's quite a lot going on in the sector at the moment in terms of regulation, including a heightened focus on improving quality and integrity, including through self-assurance. The outcomes focus in the revised standards for RTOs, which will be coming soon, which aim to further promote a culture of quality. And of course, the recent announcement by Minister O'Connor that ASQA will scope and pilot the delegation of its course accreditation function to selected TAFEs in the coming 12 months. So we will have the opportunity to unpack some of this today, as we are extremely fortunate to be joined by both the Chief Executive Officer, Saxon Rice, and Deputy CEO, Christina Bolger of ASQA. So welcome, Saxon and Christina, and thank you very much for your time today. We are also joined by members of TDA's Quality Regulation and Compliance Network, including Suniti Rukari, the Director of Educational Quality at TAFE New South Wales, and Julie Healy, the Acting Chief Academic Officer at TAFE Queensland. So Suniti and Julie will share some reflections on the evolving regulatory space from a TAFE perspective on completion of ASQA's presentation. So welcome Suniti and Julie, and thanks to you too for your time today. Before I hand over to Saxon and Christina, I would like to flag that today's session is being recorded and the recording will be made available on the TDA website and to anyone who is registered for this TAFE Talks session today. And ASQA will also share the slides from their presentation, which we will make available as well on our website. Closed captioning is also available for this event. If you have any questions that you would like to pose to any of our speakers today, and I'm sure there'll be a few, please use the Q&A box throughout the session and we'll make sure that we leave some time at the end to come back to those. It now gives me great pleasure to hand over to Saxon Rice, the CEO of ASQA, to kick off today's session. Thank you, Saxon.
Thanks very much, Lyndall, and thanks also to TAFE Directors Australia for inviting Christina and I along to talk to you about our regulatory approach, and particularly as we're entering a really key phase for the sector. And apologies again, I want to say at the outset for being unable to join you at the recent TDA conference. Understand it was a great success. Well, as we've got quite a lot to cover this afternoon, and I'm sure there'll be lots of great questions, I'm going to provide you with an overview of ASQA's maturity or continuous improvement journey over recent years, and it's an important part of understanding where we are now and what lies ahead in the next couple of years for regulation of the sector and specifically for TAFEs. What's really fundamental here is, in fact, the objects of vet regulation, and this is particularly as we're going to be, as you mentioned, Lyndall, implementing the revised standards for RTOs that skills ministers agreed last week. So I'll touch on what that means, including from a cultural perspective and some of the key dates associated with the revised standards. And implementation of the revised standards is in addition to recent legislative changes to the fit and proper person requirements, and for those of you that are CRICOS providers, proposed changes to the ESOS Act that are currently before the Parliament. I'll also touch on one of the key measures announced in the recent federal budget. Actually, Christina's going to touch on this one, that goes to the government's response to the Universities Accord report, and which is relevant to TAFEs, as you mentioned, the announcement of the tertiary harmonisation measure. And that measure is actually twofold. It includes maturing of our dual sector strategy by ASQA and TEXA, and also, as you said, ASQA piloting the delegation of our course accreditation functions. So Christina will certainly provide you a little bit more detail about what all of that is going to look like. Christina is also going to, though, focus on integrity and what that means for all providers, and particularly for TAFEs sector leadership on integrity of governance. So this slide here is the objectives of vet regulation, and I wanted to begin by flagging some of these key aspects. They're the factors relevant to ASQA's creation as the national regulator in 2011, and the factors are actually still very relevant to where we are now in 2024, particularly as we embark on implementation of the revised standards. And as I'll touch on shortly, ASQA's approach to regulation over the coming years. So I did just want to do a bit of a recap here, because we were created to provide for national consistency in the regulation of vet, and to enable that consistency, we are to regulate vet using a standards-based quality framework and risk assessments where appropriate. We also have to provide a regulatory framework that encourages and promotes a vet system that is appropriate to meet Australia's social and economic needs for a highly educated and skilled population. We were created to protect and enhance quality, flexibility and innovation in vet, as well as to protect and enhance Australia's reputation for vet nationally and internationally. We're importantly here to protect students, and the Act is really clear that that is to protect students undertaking or proposing to undertake Australian vet by ensuring the provision of quality vet. And I think it's really worth noting the call out of the protection of students proposing to undertake Australian vet, and alongside the protection of Australia's reputation, as those are really fundamental aspects that go to the integrity of the sector, and ASQA holding providers to account to meet their responsibilities as RTOs. It's also our role to facilitate access to accurate information relating to the quality of vet. And the standards is a key element of our regulatory framework, essential to promote a strong and trusted vet sector with trusted public institutions and a diverse range of high quality registered training organisations. So it is fortuitous that just on Friday, skills ministers discussed the significant progress on the revised standards for RTOs and their shared ambition to lift quality and integrity across the entire sector through a more robust, quality-driven approach to regulation. So this is our quality framework to implement, and therefore these are actually equally all your responsibility as RTOs in the vet sector. And this is a really important reminder, because as I said at the outset, we're entering a really key phase for the sector. So if we jump onto the next slide, Clark. First here, though, I want to take you, and if I actually take you to the right-hand side of this slide first, it is worth noting the diversity of the sector that ASQA regulates in 2024. Now, at the end of March this year, we regulate 3,805 RTOs. 2,905 of those deliver vet to domestic students. 643 are registered to deliver vet to overseas students, or they're CRICOS registered. And another 257 are both CRICOS and ELICOS registered. We also have 79 providers that deliver ELICOS only. We regulate 26 TAFEs, of which 10 deliver offshore. And it's also worth noting that ASQA doesn't regulate all TAFEs. Regulation of TAFEs in WA is by the West Australian Training and Accreditation Council, with the exception of TAFE International WA, which is regulated by ASQA, given it does deliver to overseas students. So if I take you to the left-hand side of this slide then, in terms of a bit of a recap on our journey to now, as I talked through on the previous slide and the objectives of vet regulation, we do have a dual mandate to ensure quality and integrity of the sector. And these two things are intertwined, and they both must be the focus for all providers. Our commitment to our dual mandate is actually reaffirmed in our formally in our statement of intent, which is in response to the Minister's statement of expectations. And that is to support the overall capability of the sector to deliver quality training and to ensure the integrity of the sector through responsive and targeted action. Now, following the rapid review of ASQA's governance, our regulatory practice and our culture in 2020, we made a number of key changes to both our practice and our regulatory culture that are actually foundational to being able to be to being more effectively able to support the overall capability of the sector, and particularly moving forward in implementing the revised standards. This includes uplifting our educative function and providing greater levels of guidance about the expectations of the regulator, as well as more effective information to providers about their performance through changes to our performance assessments. And this included things like distinguishing between minor deficiencies and significant non-compliance, so that providers could have a clearer understanding of outcomes that were being sought and where they might be falling short. We also now offer mechanisms like agreements to rectify, and that enables providers to make sustained improvements over a longer period of time in response to performance feedback. And again, this is with the outcome of sustained compliance rather than shorter timeframes that were driving quick fixes, essentially. We're also able to be more responsive and targeted in our action through a broader range of monitoring activities that we undertake. It's no longer just about audits or performance assessments, but monitoring activities and information requests, or when it's warranted, it might be an investigation or other compliance activities, including short and no-notice site visits. We're also making much more effective use of data, intelligence and information, and this has been really supercharged with the government's investment in a dedicated integrity unit for ASQA, including a tip-off line, and over the coming years, I'm sure welcomed by many of you as it relates to ASQANet, but significantly uplifting our digital data and technology capability. Now, all of these foundations are absolutely sentinel to supporting the implementation of the revised standards for RTOs. And that is because they remove a lot of prescription and focus on the outcomes being sought. And to deliver on this mandate, we are obviously always continually reviewing our operating environment and adjusting and adapting our approach accordingly. And I'm sure many, if not all of you, would agree. We have an increasingly complex operating environment facing significant reform and change for our workforces across qualification reform and certainly across the regulatory framework. So these complexities really highlight how critical your system of governance is in order for you to be aware of where your pressure points or risks are, where you might be falling short in delivering in accordance with the regulatory framework, and to have, importantly, strategies in place to address those issues. And Christina's going to talk a little bit more about that shortly. Now, if we look at where ASQA is in 2024, I think we're well placed to embark on this next phase, but we also need to recognise that there are some significant shifts still to occur in maturing our approach as the regulator, and also for the whole sector in continuing to mature your approach to the achievement of quality outcomes. Excuse me, this is particularly in relation to how you understand your effectiveness in achieving quality outcomes, as they will underpin the ability for ASQA to differentiate our regulatory supervision of providers, and specifically TAFEs, according to your context and the level of assurance your governing bodies provide. Jump onto the next slide. Thanks, Clark. So in terms of last week's meeting of skills ministers, ministers agreed to progress the standards for public release in August this year, and for them the revised standards to come into full regulatory effect from the 1st of July 2025. Now, in their communique, skills ministers did indicate that the revised standards enable TAFE to further develop your role as the trusted public provider at the heart of the vet sector. The changes in the revised standards are designed to better reflect the diversity of the vet sector overall and ensure that the standards are fit for purpose across different RTO settings. So this will help to embed quality aspirations and ensure that standards clearly articulate characteristics required of RTOs to foster a shared understanding of what constitutes high quality delivery for all users of the vet system. High quality providers, it's really important to bear in mind, don't just meet or comply with the standards. They are operating over and above the standards and continuously improving against them. They're innovating and they're excelling in the outcomes that they're achieving for students and industry. And the revised standards provide a unique opportunity for ASQA to continue to work with stakeholders across the sector to enable a more mature outcomes-focused model of regulatory supervision, whereby the existing diversity in governance, quality, culture, and self-assurance capability is able to be considered. This isn't a new regulatory approach by ASQA, but it is a maturing of our regulatory approach that is absolutely enabled by the work that we've already done to improve our regulatory practice and our deeper understanding of the performance of the sector, which will enable trusted and well-governed providers to operate more flexibly and to embrace innovation with confidence. Now, the model of regulatory supervision is in its early stages of design, and alongside implementation of the revised standards will recognise the context, governance and different levels of assurance that TAFE has in place as the public provider. Now, if we jump onto the next slide, thanks, Blake. In terms of those shifts in store with the new standards, they essentially propose significant changes to the structure and the content of the standards, but providing a clearer and more direct link between the requirements that you as RTOs are expected to meet and the outcomes that you're expected to deliver. What is really important to recognise and engage with is the cultural shifts and the change management associated with this outcomes-focused approach. And this possibly is one of the most important aspects to recognise, because I think the sector has had a long history and a deep culture of prescription of requirements in the standards, in training packages, and in seeking that same prescription from the regulator about what you need to do to be compliant. And this has also tended to drive process over good practice and layers of regulatory requirements. So we're going to be needing to work closely together over the coming months to understand the implementation of the revised standards in your contextual setting and ultimately how we'll be enforcing them from next year. This is why we will also be maturing our approach to regulatory supervision alongside these shifts, because the nature of our interest and our engagement with TAFEs will be in relation to how you're understanding the outcomes you are achieving and assuring those outcomes, rather than auditing each aspect of compliance. And that's a really important distinction. But I will leave my comments there, Christina. I'm going to hand over to Christina. She's going to talk to you a little bit more about this and also recent budget announcements and how we'll be taking that forward.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Saxon. And good afternoon, everyone. As Saxon mentioned, there's a few key measures that we wanted to provide a little more detail on this afternoon. These are under the National Skills Agreement and the Universities Accord, both of which are highlighting the need for a more integrated whole of system approach to meet Australia's current and future skills needs. So ASQA is really keen to play our part as the national vet regulator, and looking for opportunities to understand where higher education and vocational education and training regulatory systems can more effectively complement each other. Our corporate plan next year actually moves into some specific responses to the Universities Accord, particularly our commitment to continue to work with the higher education regulator, TAFEs, and to streamline our regulatory approaches where possible. And I think we're on the next slide. Thank you. So noting that ASQA and TAFEs both have different legislative instruments and different sets of standards, both agencies are really actively working on opportunities for better harmonisation there, and really looking at where our assurance under those systems can be streamlined and aligned where possible. There were two specific measures that Saxon mentioned earlier, announced by government, and they are listed here in the slide. They include developing a dual sector strategy and undertaking a pilot of delegated course accreditation. So I'd like to specifically take you through our thinking to date on those two initiatives. Next slide, thanks. There's currently, previous slide. There's currently 64 providers that are dual sector providers in the tertiary sector that are regulated by both ASQA and TAFEs, including several TAFEs. So ASQA and TAFEs' current approach already is working under some formal agreements and MOUs to support principles for the way in which we regulate. We have a working group that looks at areas of shared risk and responsibility, and information sharing protocols, also supporting information exchange between the two regulators, and collaboration around the requirements of ESOS legislation and its operation across both sectors. Apologies, we are on the previous slide. A dual sector strategy, which was announced by government, will take this work further and really facilitate a better understanding of the barriers and the opportunities to more streamlined regulation for dual sector providers, and also help provide an evidence base for initiatives that we can move forward on to address these in the short, medium and longer term. So we really look forward to working with those dual sector providers on the dual sector strategy and initiatives. The next measure that I wanted to provide some detail on was involving ASQA conducting a pilot. And this is a pilot to delegate our course accreditation function in 24-25 to really assess the benefits of delegation to selected TAFEs in areas of emerging industry needs. Just noting that we have already got 14 TAFEs with delegation to manage the scope of their registration. The intention of this new initiative is to conduct a managed pilot of the delegation of ASQA's course accreditation function. As you would know, the accredited courses and the system of qualifications framework is really designed to address skill requirements for industry, education, enterprise or community needs where they're not covered by endorsed training packages. And those VET courses also have the accredited courses also have the capacity to address changes in skills needs and the needs of emerging industries in a responsive manner. So what we want to undertake in this pilot is the function would be tested under delegation from ASQA, such that the entity exercising that delegation would be developing VET accredited courses and applying the standards in the same way as accredited courses regulated by ASQA. So the course accreditation must be in line with the standards for accredited courses. That is, that there must be a need, that it's not duplicating existing packages and units and is supported by industry. And this is really important. It's not something separate or different. It's actually just enabling a pilot to participate with TAFEs to test the delegation of that function. What it means for those TAFEs that may be participating is that delegated decisions about accreditation still need to apply those consistent interpretation of the standards for VET accredited courses and the consistency of assessment practice and outcomes to maintain the integrity and the consistency of AQF qualifications. So at this stage, the intention, and we've been in discussion with the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations on this, is that the pilot of delegation would focus on the AQF level 5 and above in the first instance, and that's really consistent with the university's accord. It will not include licensed occupations, and we anticipate involving state training authorities and bringing together a reference group so that we can work through the detail and further considerations, including how we will be evaluating the pilot. So we have to work through all of this and along with the governance arrangements to assess the benefits and understand how ASQA's course accreditation function to selected TAFEs can meet emerging industry needs. So watch this space. Right, now we've caught up with the slides. I wanted to say a few things about integrity, as Saxon mentioned. We know that non-genuine providers and bad faith operators that don't demonstrate a genuine commitment and capability to quality vocational education and training are engaging in illicit or illegal or unethical activities all damage the reputation of the sector that we work in and belong to, and present a significant threat to integrity. So integrity of the VET sector remains a key priority for ASQA. Supported by data and intelligence, and Saxon mentioned the ways in which we have enhanced our intelligence, investigation and enforcement capabilities through government's investment in an integrity unit. We are looking through the lens of risk and threats to vet integrity and using our full range of powers to take action to prevent, detect and target those entities and ensure that we are using the powers that we have to hold them to account and to remove them from the sector where necessary. And to ensure that that ASQA has the powers that it needs, legislative changes have been made, and government has also invested in ASQA, as I mentioned, in the integrity unit, and to stand up and operate a tip-off line. So since launching in October last year, the tip-off line has received over 1,330 reports. We have, to the end of March, issued 48 sanctions to cancel registration in full or not renew a provider's registration, and 15 sanctions to suspend registration. The number of sanctions imposed relates to 36 providers. The government has also invested in ASQA's digital and data systems, and this is really going to be delivering progressive uplift for ASQA right across our systems to support our powers and information sharing across government to tackle these types of risks and behaviours. But I really also want to make the point that quality integrity isn't achieved through the actions of the regulator alone. So while ASQA, as the regulator, has a key role in sector integrity, it's about all of that and the actions of providers and sector leaders. This really goes to fundamental elements to assure the quality and integrity of national qualifications issued by all providers, underpinned by organisational leadership, culture, professional standards of teaching, and the organisation's own assurance of quality and integrity and continuous improvement. The next slide, please. So thinking about what this means for TAFE and the level and the nature of ASQA's regulatory interaction and our supervision and engagement with TAFEs, supporting the new initiatives and the shift to quality and excellence that Saxon mentioned, we really expect from all providers a focus on self-assurance and demonstrable commitment to continuous improvement, embedding quality aspects into all of the organisational outcomes. This includes a continued focus on system integrity from a governance perspective. And really, this slide calls out a range of areas that are incredibly important, particularly in the current environment. Governance and leadership from TAFEs across a whole range of areas in the context of the legislative reform, a need for timely data and digital connectivity, maintaining the integrity of PRISM's data, the trainers and assessors that you employ and ensuring and supporting those professional standards in a vibrant workforce, student protections and wellbeing, and the focus that this has under the new standards, the revised standards. Fit and proper persons are really important for all training providers, ensuring that who you want in key roles are meeting the fit and proper person requirements. ASQA's expectation is, of course, that providers are at all times ensuring that people in key roles are fit and proper, that it's not just a matter of a declaration to ASQA at a point in time, but an ongoing responsibility to ensure the integrity of operations. Obviously, a provider's integrity is at risk if persons in key roles are not to be trusted. So all of this really calls out governance and leadership and the important role that TAFEs play. So we're at a really important point in the journey together with the sector, and this will be further reflected in the way that ASQA responds to the significant diversity variability in motivation and behaviours of providers as we mature the self-assurance, oversight and governance mechanisms as our regulator. From TAFE, we expect a focus on self-assurance and demonstrable commitment to continuous improvement embedded into all aspects of organisational outcomes. The amendments to the Act, the early changes to the revised standards, all contribute to improved outcomes and greater protection for students, and a stronger regulatory foundation as ASQA continues to support all providers to build that culture of self-assurance and continuous improvement. Thank you all. I'll wait for the questions.
Thank you, Christina. So I take it that concludes both you and Saxon's presentation. Wonderful. So before we actually move to some of the questions from the audience, I'd now like to invite Suniti Rakari from TAFE New South Wales to provide some reflections, or perhaps you have some questions, Suniti, on what you've just heard. So over to you, Suniti.
Thank you, Lyndall. And first of all, thank you, Saxon and Christina. That was a really insightful session on ASQA's new regulatory approach. So really appreciate you coming here and having the conversation with us. And it's really, I've got a few reflections which I'll go through, but I'd like to start with saying that it's really heartening to hear that ASQA's approach aims to empower TAFEs and really promote innovation and enhance the quality of vet delivery. Because I think that that's really an opportunity for TAFEs to align our internal quality processes and practices to ASQA's maturing approach to regulatory supervision. Those were the words that I heard you say, and I was, sort of that was really, sort of exciting from a TAFE perspective, because what that means is that we can follow your maturing approach to regulatory supervision by taking a more strategic, proactive approach and really embedding links to our governing bodies to ensure that they have full oversight of our operations. So the focus on self-assurance, as you said, integrity and governance, I think is very welcome. I'd also like to pick up the point about the draft revised RTO standards, which, as you said, are outcomes focused and really reflect ASQA's more sustained approach to compliance. And the flexibility will allow providers such as those within large public providers as TAFEs to really innovate in our training delivery. And that means that TAFEs now have an opportunity to lead the sector to design and showcase potentially some best practices, particularly for large-scale providers. And I know the question that some of us will be asking, and I've seen it already come through in some of the Q&A, is what does provider differentiation look like? So I think that, sort of unpacking that over the next few months, with a co-design approach, I think would be really important, particularly as we start to look at things like provider risk and TAFEs being trusted public providers. You touched on the announcement from Minister Brenda O'Connor that ASQA will pilot delegating its course accreditation function for selected TAFEs within the next 12 months. And I think, again, that really recognises emerging industry needs and the piece around tertiary harmonisation that you were talking about in your presentation. And, through that, we can allow TAFEs more flexibility and responsiveness to industry needs. And we can, as you said in your presentation, reduce the focus on prescriptive compliance at the expense of good organisational practice. We can also see a really clear connection between what you've said, and the discussion here today, and the work of the Qualifications Reform Design Group, which really is seeking to enable new curriculum models that provide flexibility. And, it's similar to other changes in government policy, because if we've seen that through the university's Accord report, there's a call to strengthen and expand the role of TAFEs. The National Skills Agreement aims to embed a coordinated approach to strengthen the vet sector and really address those skills needs with TAFE at the heart. And within New South Wales, because I work for TAFE New South Wales, we have an interim vet review report with a number of recommendations in a similar vein to place TAFE at the centre of reform. So all of these drivers are really pointing to one thing, and they're pointing to opportunities for innovation. And I'd really like to end my reflection with a call to action for, sort of members of TAFEs in the audience here, that we have an opportunity to start thinking meaningfully about quality, about flexibility and innovation. And I think we're all looking forward to working with ASQA to develop this further. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Suniti. Julie Healy, TAFE New South Wales, reflections from you.
Thanks, Lyndall. Reiterating what Suniti has just outlined there, I think firstly, really welcome ASQA being so open to sharing their time and their the information with us today, because I think it just shows and demonstrates that true, genuine commitment to working with the providers to actually, make sure that we have a regulatory environment that is reflective of what the key goals that all of TAFEs are aiming to work towards. I think, I'm conscious of not reiterating some of the words that Suniti has provided. If we sort of focus on our journey and where we've gone, where ASQA is taking us in terms of the regulatory space, what is really refreshing is that increased focus on integrity and continuous improvement. I think that is really highlighting the commitment. In terms of self-assurance, I think, really super important. And I guess it was, it is 2022 when that particular initiative was first muted. And as a large public provider, I think it was reasonably easy and straightforward to shift our focus to self-regulation and self-assurance, because we are lucky that we have, quite strong governance models. We've got good student support services. So really it was a matter of refocusing our quality assurance activities and really driving that focus to continuous improvement. So, what we've done is adopt, there's a lot of similar approaches to what ASQA has in terms of the risk-based approach, investing time, energy where it should be, and looking and reflecting some of your approaches to how you manage your performance assessments and the outcomes from those assessments, especially in terms of rectification of issues and so on, and drawing that focus on continuous improvement, which it's easy to bring the workforce along on the journey because they can see that this is about the students, it's about outcomes, quality outcomes and so on, as opposed to that focus on compliance and the stick. So I think, it's been really helpful from an internal perspective as well to have that shift in focus. I'm really looking forward to then undertaking our RTO re-registration under that self-assurance model. I'm interested to see where we go with the qualification redesign and how then, especially with the differentiated qualification models that have been proposed there, and a lot of the reports are saying, they're leveraging off the quality reform and the new standards and so on. So I'm interested to hear your perspectives of how that will align with the different specificity perhaps within the differentiated qualification models, and then how do we tie that in from a compliance perspective. In terms of the new standards, thank you. It's great, it's refreshing, it's good to see the reduction and the focus on outcomes. It shows a genuine commitment to focusing on the student. I love the changes and the trust. You used the word trust several times within your presentation, but I think it shows the level of trust that you are allowing for those with good self-assurance models in terms of transition arrangements, because I know that's been a major challenge for many TAFEs, given their scope of registrations being very large. So to manage those students well and to truly protect the student and not disadvantage the student has been quite a challenge. And so certainly welcoming those changes to the standards. Similarly with the credentialing policy, the changes there that will help us address the workforce challenges, especially in the emerging areas. So, again, looking forward to implementing. I guess the query I have around it is the timeline. So with the recent release, and you announced there today that whilst the standards will be released in August, the requirement to comply or take full regulatory effect is not to the 1st of July 2025. We're working towards that shift, the mapping across, the realignment to the new standards. So we'd rather be moving to them sooner than later, given, the benefits that they bring. I'm wondering how then we overnight, if we're making this progress and planning towards shifting to adhere and comply with the new standards, we'd like to do it sooner than later. Then how do we meet the requirements of old, but overnight then meet the requirements of the new? What's that transition look like, and how can we manage that? As I said, our desire would be to move sooner than later. Really looking forward to that opportunity in terms of co-design with both the dual sector strategy and the piloting of the course accreditation. And I'm glad that you provided the clarity, the big ta-da moment in terms of the conference and the announcement of self-accreditation. Got a lot of people excited, but I think you provided the clarity that this is about delegation of the course accreditation. So thank you for providing that today. And as I said, look forward to volunteering TAFE Queensland to be part of that co-design project. And be interested to see whether you mentioned about AQF level 5 and above, and emerging. This is to meet the emerging needs of industry. Often the industry is looking for skill sets more than qualifications. So will that course design process allow us to perhaps pull together skill sets more than full qualifications? So really interested to be involved there. Lastly, I just wanted to talk about the role of ASQA in terms of education and guidance in that role, and again applaud you for the work that you've undertaken over the last 2 years. Certainly the Spotlight On series was very, very well received and very successful. Seems to have dropped off a little bit, so I can't wait for that to pick up, and obviously that it's going to be a very, very important role as the new standards are rolled out, and I'm hoping that will sort of kick off again as they are released in August. And just another key bit of feedback, and I'm sure this is reiterated by many, the ASQA IQ. Love that approach, really, really helpful. I know, the format change helps us, and what we've done from our perspective is, those same focus areas that you share each month becomes our focus area for quality assurance activities, allows us to test against what's being promoted, and allow us to then drive some quality improvement, which really is what underpins the whole self-assurance model. So yeah, thank you, and I appreciate the time and really look forward to further dealings.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you again to all of our speakers, and to Saxon and Christina. So a lot of questions coming through and a lot of big issues to cover. Some of the things that I've picked up is that there is a bit of a strong interest in the concept of the differentiation in regulatory supervision. Of course, what the governance of the delegation of course accreditation might look like. There's obviously a lot of interest in the new standards and the transition arrangements to the new standards. And I will remind everyone that in regards to the RTO standards, ASQA are not actually the ones writing them. They're being developed by the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations. So we need to keep our questioning in that context, I guess. And then there's qualification reform has come up a few times, harmonisation in the tertiary education sector and what barriers might need to be removed, and a question around ASQA's approach and view of the use of AI. So I don't know where you'd like to begin with all of that, Saxon and Christine, but perhaps you might like to talk a little bit more about the concept of differentiation in regulatory supervision. You talk about different risk-based approaches which recognise the diversity and maturity of different providers in the sector. But what would that actually look like for TAFEs as a public provider? How would your regulatory approach be different?
Thanks, Lyndall, and thanks, Suniti and Julie, for all of your comments, and hopefully we'll be able to cover off on as much as we possibly can in the remaining time. I would probably maybe just couch, and Christina, forewarning, I'm going to throw to you on this particular question, but I just wanted to couch it initially in saying there's early thinking in relation to the differentiated model of regulatory supervision and what that might look like, and we can already understand some of what that differentiation already looks like, including, as Christina touched on, the fact that some providers, including I think it's 14 TAFEs, already have delegation to manage their own scope of registration. So there's a level of trust and confidence in in those delegation arrangements, for example. So it's building on that sort of very early stage model is what this what the overall model looks like, and I guess just bearing in mind that this is something that will need to be designed and co-designed and engaged with the sector around, including that everyone has a very clear understanding as to what that differentiation means. It is intended that we move to implement the model alongside the implementation of the revised standards for RTOs, and this will continue to evolve realistically over the coming years. So it's prefacing, I guess, Christina's kind of initial comments or thinking in the context of the very early stages of design. And perhaps if I just also touch on the course accreditation delegation pilot as well. Similarly, early stages of consideration, and it really is in part also about understanding the role that accredited courses play in the AQF, but also in meeting particular needs. And so those are all very important factors in terms of the design of this pilot and some of the things that we'll be looking to test in the pilot. Again, bearing in mind that it is an initial piece of work to consider and evaluate in amongst a much bigger structure of qualifications, that we can look at the ways in which that further innovation and those sorts of things can occur moving forward. So it's pieces, I guess. I'm trying to manage expectations, perhaps not particularly well, but manage expectations as to what this looks like now, what it might look like in 12 months, and what it might look like in 3 to 5 years down the track are really important to bear in mind. In large part because of, or in large part bearing in mind the shifts, those cultural shifts that I'll say the collective sector, including ASQA, need to also manage in terms of that change and supporting that change and supporting the people side of that change as we do this over the coming years, and just not underestimating what's required on that front. So really being able to work very closely together around all of that. So couching it in those expectation management of expectations, Christina, I'll throw to you because I know you have been doing some work on early ideas in this space and the ways in which we'll be taking it forward.
Thanks, Saxon. Yes, and I think it is really an evolution for the way in which we are interacting with the entities that we regulate. And, we've had that risk-based model in place for some time where we differentiate our response to providers based on the level of assessed risk, but it's tended to have a real focus on compliance. And what we want to build in and underpin the way in which we're differentiating the sector is also on the level of assurance that we have. So the level of assurance that a high-performing provider might provide us will lead us into different ways of regulating in terms of the nature and the level of our engagement, where we're less likely to be boots on the ground and, really checking the nature of risk and compliance, and moving to a level where we're able to understand how the provider themselves is assuring that they are meeting their obligations and exceeding those. So, it's just adding that dimension that we're very much aware that we have a huge range of diversity and variability in the level at which providers are currently doing that. Some providers are focused solely on compliance, which means that they're missing those opportunities to focus on the outcomes that are intended by the standards, and they're not striving for continuous improvement, but simply looking to the regulator and wanting to know where that line is. So that's the cultural shift that we want to make, but we're seeking to do that by recognizing where those mechanisms and assurances are in place, the assurances that we have through other regulatory frameworks, dual sector, the states and territories involvement. So that just helps us to better articulate what might be building on our risk-based model, but better recognising the level of assurance that we can understand and seek through providers' maturity and through other regulatory systems. So I think that's sort of the underpinning principle that we need to then work through the detail of how that would work. And, you know, we've been moving in this direction for some time with the range of monitoring activities and the varied levels of interaction with entities that we regulate based on a level of assessed risk. So this is a maturation and, as Saxon said in her presentation, a really, really important stage for the sector, and helping to move towards that quality of embedded culture, continuous improvement. So further work ahead and lots of conversations to have, but that's the sort of underpinning principle that will sort of underpin the design.
And Linda, if I can just add, because Julie, you mentioned you're looking forward to TAFE Queensland's re-registration in this kind of model. And it's actually a really important one to point to, because not last year, the year before, we actually piloted an approach with all Victorian TAFEs who were approaching their re-registration. And in the context of being able to engage, I was around about 12 months out from the expiry of registration, so that we could understand more about the context of each of those providers in the ways in which they are assuring their own outcomes, and really to be able to undertake that work and the assurance essentially to the regulator well ahead of the registration expiry date approaching, so that, you know, it makes it a much more streamlined process for the administration of the application for registration renewal at the time that it's falling due. So it's really being able to broaden those approaches that we've already begun to pilot with TAFEs in that instance.
And I might just add, Saxon, that, you know, we're actually seeing some really positive behaviours that are good examples of a self-assurance approach, and really being proactive in engaging with ASQA as the regulator. We've had a number of TAFEs positively disclose where they have had an adverse event or other regulatory action, and really getting on the front foot with engaging with us around what they're doing to address those areas where they might have assessed that they're falling short, and the way in which that is then understood by the regulator, and it lends itself to that mature approach, which we've applied in dealing with non-compliance through the agreement to rectify, but just brings that forward. So it's not necessarily contingent on, you know, a regulatory action, but is actually part of that mature conversation in identifying where there are areas identified for improvement. So, you know, that's the type of thing that will really support the focus on the outcomes and ensure quality, whilst still maintaining the safeguards and the assurance because of the visibility that those matters have.
Great, thank you. I think we'll move on to a couple of questions around the delegation of course accreditation and the pilot. I've had a question: how will the selected TAFEs be chosen to pilot this course accreditation, and can dual sectors be included? And can you also talk a little bit more around the expectations that ASQA would have for self-accrediting provider governance arrangements, and whether or not existing TAFE governance arrangements would need to be reviewed?
Yeah, thanks, Linda. A lot in all of those questions. And I saw that, if I maybe go to the end bit first, I saw that question just now from Ian around provider governance, self-accrediting provider governance arrangements. This is a really interesting one. And again, look, I have to preface all of the response here in saying it's evolving in its design. We're working very closely with the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations in terms of the design of this pilot, including the ways in which we'll likely be seeking expressions of interest in terms of participation in the pilot. But from a governing body perspective, and I think this is the part of needing to truly understand the difference between self-accrediting status from a higher ed perspective, which I know, TEXA is equally focused on in terms of where that might be something sought by a dual sector TAFE, and the delegation of ASQA's course accreditation functions. So it really is, as Christina was saying in her presentation, the ability for the TAFEs that form part of this pilot to perform the function as if you were ASQA. That's the nature of the delegation. So it's ensuring that the performance of the function is in accordance with the standards for accredited courses. And from a governing body perspective, I think it really does require that consideration of the expertise on the governing body in terms of ultimately the assurance to the governing body about the performance of this function internally within the relevant TAFE, but then also to ASQA. So we really want to work through all of the detail of what that might look like. And it may well evolve depending on the nature of what the initial pilots might be, or the nature of the qualifications that the initial pilots might be in. We'll have to work that through based on the TAFEs that we're working with here, and the particular levels, the industry area, all of those sorts of things, so that we can ensure we've got an effective evaluation to make the most of this opportunity and what it might hold for the future. Christina, do you want to add anything more to that?
No, look, I think that's the level of the thinking to date, Saxon. There's still quite a bit to work through there, but I think because it's delegated, it's actually the same regulatory framework that's sitting around the need to apply the standards, and also the expertise in the actual assessment of the course to meet the requirements of the AQF. So the nature of the participating TAFEs will need to be ready in that space, as well as the way in which ASQA would need to be assured about the exercise of that delegated function. So just thinking about how we might build in that reporting, so that that's evident, and that we have what we need to work together on the evaluation of the pilots.
Got time to squeeze in one more big question. So we're interested in hearing ASQA's views on what harmonisation in the tertiary education sector looks like, and from ASQA's perspective, what barriers would need to be removed to allow harmonisation. And I know that's a big question, and you've only got about 1 minute or two to answer it.
It's a huge question, Lyndall. But look, I think so ASQA's certainly been working very closely with TEXA over a number of years in terms of the ways in which our respective regulatory frameworks, which, as Christina touched on, are very, very different, can be more effectively interconnected. And we've got a level of that occurring already. What we really want to do in this dual sector strategy is really build on each other's levels of assurance between the two regulators, but the levels of assurance and satisfaction with that assurance by TEXA or by ASQA from those governing bodies. So it's really building in that maturing of the self-assurance model. And I guess the reason I'm sort of focused particularly there is because there is a lot more to the areas of focus in terms of tertiary harmonisation that the Universities Court report really went to, and regulation is one aspect of that. So, and I think that's really what the report overall was touching on. There's legislative components, there's regulatory components, there's structural components, then sort of overlaid in terms of the ways in which, from a regulatory perspective, we can make that a more streamlined space for the providers delivering in this area, but in a way that also, you know, ultimately the purpose there is to much better affect the parity of the two sectors and the ways in which they work together. I think it's really the beginning of a journey that all of these pieces that we're currently talking about, the move to, you know, the regulatory journey that ASQA's been on, and our regulatory practice changes, the changes in our regulatory culture, the new standards and the way in which we are engaging with our ability to continue to mature our regulatory approach, as just as much as the sector itself is continuing to mature the approach to the excellence in training outcomes, and the ways in which that can also mature the approach across the tertiary space. So I think, you know, there's a great launch pad at this juncture, and why it's, I guess, very, as I say, entering a really key phase for the vet sector in terms of how we take that forward. But there's an absolute commitment, maybe if I close with saying there's an absolute commitment between ASQA and TEXA, certainly, to really do everything we possibly can through that dual sector strategy from a regulatory perspective to support the dual sector providers.
Thank you, Saxon. And we'll have to leave it there for today, unfortunately. But thank you again to all of our speakers today, to Saxon, Christina, Suniti and Julie. We really appreciate your time and your reflections. It's been really beneficial for our audience to hear directly from you on some of these developments and what it'll actually mean for TAFE. So we really appreciate your time. The next TAFE Talk sessions will take place on the 12th of June. If you're interested in registering, please visit the TDA website or read the TDA newsletter. That brings today's session to a close. Thank you to everyone and goodbye for now.